The German sniper had been in his position since before dawn, 6 hours motionless. His face was covered in ash, a trick he had learned on the Eastern Front. His rifle, a Carabiner 98K with the 4-power ZF-41 scope, rested on a folded jacket to muffle the metal against stone. Behind him, camouflaged among branches, was his exit route, a shallow trench he had dug 2 nights before, running back to the German lines. Every detail was correct. Everything had been done exactly the way his instructors at the training depot near Udenburg had taught him. He knew what he was hunting: American infantry. He had studied their patterns for a week before selecting this position. A farmhouse window at the edge of a Norman village, 2nd floor, half shuttered. He knew where they moved. He knew where they paused to rest. He knew where their officers stood. His scope was already set on the intersection 200 meters ahead. The first American had already appeared once that morning, checked something, and stepped back into cover. The shooter had let him live. Discipline. Wait for the right target. Wait for an officer. The men who had trained him were Eastern Front veterans, some of the best marksmen of the entire war. Matthias Hetzenau. 345 confirmed kills. The highest scoring Axis sniper. Sepp Alle Allerberger, the 2nd most successful sniper in the Wehrmacht. A village carpenter from near Salzburg who had learned his craft against Soviet aces in the mountains around Varoshi. On the Eastern Front, these men had built up a science. They knew how to find the enemy sharpshooter, and they knew, or thought they knew, how the enemy sharpshooter would find them. That was the entire theory of German sniping in 1944. The enemy hunts you, you hunt him. Whoever is patient wins. But the shooter in that farmhouse window would not survive the day. And what killed him was not another sniper. It was not artillery from behind the American lines. It was not a lucky ricochet from a machine gun. What killed him was something for which his training had left no room at all. An American soldier who did not think like a hunter. An American soldier who thought like a defender. Today we are going to look at one of the strangest failures in the history of military sharpshooting. In 3 years on the Eastern Front, German snipers had become perhaps the deadliest marksmen on earth. They had killed thousands of Soviet troops. They had accounted for entire officer corps of Red Army divisions. And then in the summer of 1944, they collided with an army that had almost no formal sniper program of its own. An army whose training in fieldcraft, as one military historian put it plainly, was less thorough than the German equivalent. An army that had spent almost no times on the specialized art the Germans had spent years perfecting. And within weeks, the German sniper program in the West began to fall apart. Popular history will tell you it was numbers. Popular history will tell you it was American artillery. Popular history will tell you it was the endless flow of ammunition, or the M1 Garand's 8 rounds against the K985. All of that is true, but it is not the answer. To understand what really happened, to understand why an Austrian carpenter with hundreds of confirmed kills would come to fear the woods around Ain in a way he had never feared the woods around Kharkov, we need to go back to the classroom where the Germans learned to hunt. And we need to understand what they were never taught about the men they would meet in the West. Part 1. The Mirror Game. How the Germans learned to hunt. The training depot near Udenburg, tucked into the foothills of the Austrian Alps, was a well-organized machine. Sepper, sent there in the last quarter of 1943, later described it with a sniper's precise memory in the account published under his pseudonym decades later. There was a shooting garden, a miniature landscape complete with a village and roads where students shot small-caliber sporting rifles at enemy figures that appeared briefly in windows, doorways, and behind trees. The targets moved on ropes. The instructors constantly rebuilt the landscape to make each exercise harder. Ohlberger, already an experienced killer by the time he arrived, was often called on to share his frontline experience with the class. He shined at those exercises. The instructors listened. The men who taught in these depots were the survivors of years of stalking Soviets across Ukraine, the Caucasus, and the frozen wastes north of Leningrad. They knew what they were about. They taught patience above all else. Every graduate had to hit a small target without fail at 325 to 435 yards. They taught camouflage, the art Allerberger became famous for with his umbrella of collected brush that he lifted and lowered like a portable hide. They taught the estimation of distance, the reading of wind, the practiced use of dummies, moved on ropes to draw enemy fire, and they taught something else, something so deeply built into the curriculum that no one at the time ever wrote it down as a separate lesson. They taught how to think like the enemy marksman. This was the entire logic of the Eastern Front. If you were a German sharpshooter, your most dangerous enemy was not a Soviet infantryman. It was another specialist, a man in a hide across a smashed street in Stalingrad, a woman, and there were many, in a tree outside Kursk. Somebody who thought the same way you did, saw terrain the same way you did, had learned by staying alive that this bush is too obvious, and that window is too dark, and that ledge is where an eye would go first. Every German training exercise was at its core an exercise in mirror thinking. Where would he hide? Where would he shoot from? What position would draw his fire first? The Germans got very good at this. So good that they became, in the words of one British sniper report from Normandy, quite exceptional in their ability to remain concealed while identifying and engaging targets at ranges up to 1,000 meters. The system worked. It worked because the Soviets were building an identical system. Vasily Zaitsev, the most famous Soviet marksman, had been a hunter of wolves in the Ural Mountains before the war. When he stalked Germans in the ruins of Stalingrad, he was doing something he had done all his life. A hunter looking for another hunter. The Germans and the Soviets fought a 2-year duel in which both sides thought the same thoughts about the same terrain. But here is what nobody in the classroom at Udenberg realized. They were not building marksmen who could kill any enemy. They were building marksmen who could kill an enemy who thought like a marksman. The whole curriculum assumed that the man on the other side of the field would ask the same question. Where is the shooter? How does he see me? For the Germans, this was not a bug. It was the entire foundation of their success. And in June of 1944, the machine that had been perfected against Soviet aces was moved to the west, where it would meet for the first time in years of war an opponent who was not playing the same game at all. At first, the results looked like a total German victory. In the first weeks after D-Day, American units in the Bocage, the ancient hedgerow country of Normandy, were being systematically picked apart. The Wikipedia summary of the period is, in its rare understatement, the U.S. Army's lack of familiarity with sniping tactics proved disastrous in Normandy. American after-action reports from June and early July of 1944 describe the same scene over and over. A platoon moves into a field. One man goes down. The rest hit the ground, and then they are eliminated one after another by a single rifle they never see. This should have been a preview of a long, slow bleeding. Every field costing a squad, every hedge costing a lieutenant. If the German program in the West had continued to work the way it had worked in the East, the Normandy campaign might have taken twice as long, and the road to Berlin might have cost the Americans 100,000 additional casualties. But that is not what happened. Something began to shift by mid-July, and by August, the same shooters who had been massacring platoon in June were the ones being hunted through the tree lines. What changed? The answer starts with something the German instruction had never accounted for. It starts with the men who were walking down those Norman lanes with M1 Garens in their hands, looking at hedge with eyes that had been trained in a school no army ever built. It starts with what those men had done, most of them before they had ever been drafted, because a lot of them had grown up hunting deer. Part 2. The Farm Boy, a Country of Hiders. The American infantryman of 1944 was not by any measure a specialist. He had gone through basic training, about 8 weeks of general military instruction, at places like Fort Benning or Camp Walters. He had shot on the rifle range. He had learned to keep his weapon clean. He had drilled on formations, small unit tactics, first aid. Then he'd been shipped to specialized training, then to overseas replacement depots, and eventually to a unit somewhere in Europe, often as a green replacement for a man who had just been killed. He was not a hunter of men. The Army had made almost no attempt to teach him to be one. The 296th Infantry Regiment did some sniper training in Puerto Rico in early 1943. Photographs survive of soldiers climbing palm trees with pole climbers, learning to hide in the fronds. But this was isolated. The formal American sniper program during the war remained, in the assessment of one recent history, haphazard indeed, dependent almost entirely on whether an individual commander cared enough to build a course. When the U.S. Army Sniper School was finally established in 1987, It was an explicit recognition of a gap that had lasted more than 4 decades. So, who was he? This ordinary soldier the Germans were about to meet. He was statistically a rural boy. In 1940, the census recorded that roughly 43% of the American population lived in rural areas, on farms, in small towns, in unincorporated communities where the nearest neighbor might be a half-mile down a dirt road. Rifle ownership in that world was not political the way it is today. It was practical. A firearm was how you kept coyotes off the chickens. A firearm was how you got venison in November when the meat had to last the winter. A firearm was a tool your father had shown you how to use when you were 9 or 10 years old. By 16, you could hit a rabbit at 70 yards from a standing position without particularly thinking about it. The Army did not have to teach these boys to shoot. It had to teach them to shoot within a system, to fire on command, to hold fire until command, to work with a squad. But the raw material of marksmanship was already there. When the American Rifleman correspondent visited the First Army in Normandy in July 1944, he wrote about specific individuals he'd interviewed, men who had been shooting colonels' protégés for 3 years in the same regiment, whose scores were mounting steadily as they picked German soldiers out of the hedges. These men were not products of an official school. They were rural marksmen who had been extraordinary shots since childhood, and the Army had simply given them a task. But shooting was not the important thing. Shooting was what the Germans expected. What the Germans did not expect was what the rural boys had been doing since they were small. They had been sitting in tree-ends watching for deer. They had been walking creek beds looking for turkey. They had spent hundreds of hours, not tactical hours, not military hours, hours as a child, hours as a teenager, reading terrain from the perspective of the animal being hunted. Where does a deer bed down for the night? A deer beds down where it can see 2 directions and cannot be approached from behind. Where does a rabbit hide? Where the brush is thick and the ground is close. Where does a fox den? Where the wind carries approach smells away. None of this was military training. All of it was a form of terrain reading that came from the opposite side of the encounter. The hunter of animals is not thinking like a shooter. He is thinking like the animal. He is asking, what would I do if I were the thing being hunted? Where would I be if I wanted to see without being seen? This is a different question from the one the German specialist asks. The German asks, where do I shoot from? The American rural boy, without even naming what he was doing, was asking where would I hide that is defender's thinking, and it produced very different answers about the same piece of ground. Consider a Norman hedge. The German sharpshooter, thinking as an offensive shooter, evaluates it for fields of fire. Can I engage a road? Can I engage a field crossing? What is my exit route? He selects a position, often brilliantly, that gives him a wide arc of fire in multiple ways out. Now imagine the American soldier looking at the same hedgerow. He is not asking where he would shoot from. He is asking if a shooter were hiding here, where would he be? And his answer is not a hunter's answer. It is a hider's answer. It is the answer of a boy who spent years being invisible to deer. The German position, carefully selected, obvious to another sniper as a killing spot, was often equally obvious to an American who had spent his childhood being still. By late June of 1944, American units were still taking sniper casualties. But something was changing about how they responded. And here is the point that would have terrified the Germans if they had understood it. The men who were finding them were not other snipers. They were ordinary riflemen. They were farm boys with M1 Garands who had walked into a field, taken one shot, gone to ground, and then instead of trying to hunt back, had done something the German training had never prepared anyone to defend against. Because the American defender did not hunt the sniper, he held the ground and he made the sniper position untenable. And that shift from hunter's game to defender's game was the beginning of the end. Every like on this video helps stories like these reach the people who live them or the families who remember them. It is a small thing. Please do it. And remember men like Sergeant Russell Wormy shot through the neck in a Norman lane on June 18, 1944, from a hedge he never saw, because the lesson he paid for was the lesson that saved the platoon behind him. Part 3. The turning of the hedge. The turning point in Normandy did not have a name. It did not happen on a particular day, and no historian has ever singled out the moment when the American infantry stopped being victims of German sharpshooting and started being its executives. But you can see it happening if you read the divisional after-action reports in sequence. In early June, the reports are grim. Company C of the 26th Infantry Regiment fighting outside Kumlipa was locked in what became a 30-day stalemate along the hedge. GI-1 summary notes could not see the Germans, but the Germans could see them. Sergeant Warame, a company sniper who had learned his trade in Sicily and North Africa, described a war reduced to hearing. He remembered walking slowly through sunken lanes, listening for signs of the enemy. The only offensive action available was to fire blindly through the hedges, a kind of reconnaissance by desperation. And still the shooters kept coming. Wormy himself was ambushed on June 18th, walking down a Norman lane with privates Delbert Carey and Robert Beer. He remembered opening a gate, walking about 30 yards into what looked like an empty field, and catching a movement in his peripheral vision. The bullet, he recalled, went through his neck and came out through his back. He survived. Many of his men did not. By late June, though, small changes are visible in the paperwork. Company C's patrols are reporting they have heard specific sounds, shovels, voices, footsteps behind hedges, and are relaying coordinates. On June 29th, engineers removed 4 anti-personnel mines from north of the trail. On June 22nd, a Company C patrol identified 6 or 7 Germans moving out of mortar and machine gun positions and called in 81mm mortar fire from Company D. On June 14th, the 1st Infantry Division's G2 reported that the enemy began to dig in, constructing numerous strongpoints, roadblocks, wire entanglements, and sowing anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The Americans were listening now. They were mapping. They were treating the whole terrain as a defensive problem. What is happening in these reports, though the paperwork does not name it, is that the Americans have stopped trying to play the sharpshooter's game. They're no longer trying to hunt him with another sharpshooter. They are treating him the way you would treat any dangerous animal that keeps threatening your farm. You do not stalk him. You saturate the areas where he lives with something that makes those areas uninhabitable. Mortars, artillery, mass rifle fire, reconnaissance by fire, the deliberate expenditure of rounds into positions that might or might not be occupied. American doctrine had always emphasized firepower, but in the hedge, the doctrine collided with a specific problem, and the solution began to emerge that was doctrinally strange, and from the German perspective, almost incomprehensible. The Germans had trained to defeat a hunter, but the Americans were not sending hunters. They were sending farmers. Think about what a farmer does when a wolf is killing his sheep. He does not go into the woods with a rifle and try to outstalk the wolf. He walks the fence lines. He asks, where would the wolf come through? Where does the ground give cover for a big animal? He builds his fences higher there. He sets his dogs to that side of the field at dusk. And when he does hunt the wolf, he brings 4 men, 3 dogs, and a plane. This is defenders' thinking, and it is not an accident that so many American infantrymen fell into it naturally. It was how a large portion of them had grown up thinking about the world. The shift is documented in the correspondence of the period. A First Army report from July 1944, later quoted in American Rifleman, described a change. The tree sniper, a favorite German and Japanese tactic, had already declined in popularity. Why? Because, the report noted plainly, the rifle marksmanship of the Americans has caused a marked decline in the popularity of the tree sniper idea. An American with an M1 Garand, given even a hint of where a shot had come from, could rake a tree with 8 rapid rounds. Then he could reload and rake it again. The Germans stopped climbing trees, not because the trees were bad positions, they were not, but because Americans made them death sentences. The hedge was different. It offered more options. And this is where the American defensive mindset produced something the German curriculum could not answer. There were men in the American ranks who became known as stalkers. American Rifleman's correspondent writing from Normandy on July 25, 1944 described them. The specialist, the stalker and scout who goes looking for trouble, and the sniper who waits patiently in an outpost to pick off enemy mortar or artillery observers, outpost guards or machine gun crews. Many of the hero stories being written from here concern the stalkers, men with 20 or 30 Germans, to the credit of their stealth and their marksmanship. 20 or 30. Not on a formal sniper school's records because there was no formal sniper school. Not with a special scoped rifle because most did not need one. Just an M1 Garand and a farm boy's understanding of how to disappear. Private First Class Register was one of them. American rifleman told his story that summer. He noticed rustling along a connecting hedger, waited, concentrated on that spot, and became certain a German shooter was lying in a ditch on his side of the field, camouflaged, concealed, and unable to get to the safe side. Register asked an artillery observer to spot for him, and fired a single shot. Observation, the correspondent wrote, proved unnecessary. His first shot brought a cry from the ditch, a noticeable movement of a body, and then the long silence. Register had thought like the German, not the way a sniper thinks like another sniper, like a farmer thinks like a fox. And the fox was in the ditch, exactly where a hider would be. And in the ditch was where he died. Staff Sergeant W.L. Michael of Colorado Springs, interviewed for the same magazine, had 5 Germans to his credit. All of them shot out of trees during the earlier advance inland. In one hedgerow engagement, he and his lieutenant were on one side of a hedge, Germans on the other. The lieutenant stood up to throw a grenade in what he thought was the general direction of the enemy. A German officer with a machine pistol fired first. Moe saw the movement in the hedge, fired a quick shot and killed him. Another German started running beyond the hedge. Michael grabbed the hedge itself, pulled himself up above it, and fired 3 shots, bringing that German down in what his buddies called a fancy piece of shooting. None of this is what German training had prepared for. This was not sniper duel. This was terrain reading combined with reflexive marksmanship executed by ordinary riflemen who had internalized both the hider's eye and the shooter's hand. And it was only the beginning of what was coming, because the American army was starting to build something the Germans had never really faced. A system of anti-sniper response that did not require any snipers of its own at all. When that system was in place, the German sharpshooter in the West stopped being a threat and started being a liability. The German high command could not afford to keep committing to the fight. Part 4. Reconnaissance by fire. The system that answered, by August of 1944, something is shifting in the paper record that survives on the German side too. Post-war interrogations, memoirs, and after-action reports from Wehrmacht units in the West describe a change in the way sharpshooting was working. In the East, a good marksman could operate for weeks or months from behind the same set of positions, hunting Soviet forward observers and machine gun crews, sometimes doubling back into positions he'd used before. In the West, positions became disposable. Fire once, twice at most, and get out. Because if the Americans located you, if they even suspected the general direction you were in, what came back was not a return shot. What came back was, in the terminology of American infantry doctrine, reconnaissance by fire. The unit expended rounds, sometimes a lot of rounds. American commanders had been told in explicit terms in the reports coming out of the beachhead that reinforcement infantry did not know how to do this. Reinforcements have no idea of when to open fire. Reconnaissance by fire is unknown to them. One training assessment noted, "They should know when they reach us that it is better to expend ammunition on positions that are not occupied than fail to cover it. Better to waste bullets than to leave a German alive who had watched you walk." That was the operating principle. And if reconnaissance by fire produced any response, a movement, a return shot, a snap twig, the situation escalated instantly. Mortars mounted at platoon and company level went into action within seconds. Artillery, if a forward observer could bring it, followed within minutes. American infantry doctrine at every level from squad to division was built around the calling of supporting fire, and the fire was massive. An American mortar section could put a dozen 60mm rounds into a 100 square meter patch of hedgerow before the man who had fired the first shot could realistically move. Sepper Front had refined a technique of firing and immediately relocating. It was survivable there because Soviet mortar fire, while dangerous, was not always well coordinated at the tactical level. In the West, the coordination was completely different. American forward observers were embedded down to platoon level. When they called in a target, the response time was often under 2 minutes. A German sharpshooter, having fired his single shot, might not be dead, but he was often trapped. And this is where the German training's assumption began to become a fatal weakness. The Wehrmacht sniper had been taught what to do when confronted by another sniper. He had not been taught what to do when confronted by 3 mortar tubes and a company of angry infantrymen who had watched their sergeant get killed. The Eastern Front had rarely presented that problem. The Western Front presented it constantly. By the fall of 1944, entering the woods of the Hürtgen Forest and the border battles around Aachen, German shooters in the West were surviving less time in the field than any specialists on the German side. Historian Dr. Robert Rush, whose work on the 22nd Infantry Regiment in the Hürtgen Forest is definitive, documented an 87% casualty rate for that regiment on its first day of fighting. Every man on both sides of that fight was dying, but the marksmen on the German side were dying disproportionately. And they were often not dying to counter snipers. They were dying to artillery. They were dying to mortar barges that saturated their positions. They were dying because the Americans could not be baited into the classic sharpshooters duel. The German High Command, for its part, seems to have understood the problem in a language it could name. Interrogations of captured German shooters late in 1944 and into 1945 revealed a shift in the deployment doctrine. Increasingly, snipers in the West were being pulled back to defensive positions inside built-up areas, villages, towns, factory districts, where they could shoot from windows and disappear into cellars. The open country of the Hedge and later of the Ardennes and the Rhineland had become a killing zone for the men trained to hunt in it. And then there was the other thing, the thing that spread by rumor through the Wehrmacht faster than any official communication ever did. If you were captured as a sniper by American troops, you often did not survive the walk to the rear. This part of the war has been documented carefully and quietly in the post-war academic literature. American historian Peter Shrivers in The Crash of Ruin and Simon Mackenzie in his 1994 study of prisoner treatment both note that sharpshooters occupied a special category. Stephen Ambrose in Citizen Soldiers wrote plainly that were less inclined to accord the honors of war to members of the SS, to those who surrendered too late, and to snipers. Osprey Publishing's Bolt Action Campaign Guide summarizes what the historical sources record without embellishment. There are many accounts of snipers being executed on capture, and just as many of snipers being shunned and socially outcast by soldiers of their own army. An aide to General Omar Bradley tellingly noted the general's position on the matter. Bradley, according to the aide's account, said he would not take action against anyone who decided to treat a captured sniper a little more roughly than they are being treated at present. If caught, the specialist could expect to suffer for his art. This was not policy. This was a general looking away. The reasons were not moral. They were practical. American units that had lost men to a sharpshooter felt an anger that did not distinguish between rules of war and rules of survival. A sniper's target selection, deliberate, individual, personal, felt to the men on the receiving end of it like assassination rather than combat. And so from a purely mathematical perspective, the German specialist in the West faced a compound problem. His position was likely to be located by defensive-minded infantrymen who thought like hiders. It was likely to be saturated with fire before he could relocate, and if he did survive to surrender, he was likely to be killed anyway. If you had a father or grandfather who fought in this campaign, who moved through those Norman Hedge or those Hürtgen woods, who saw what those weeks did to men, please share their name in the comments. What unit did they serve with? Where did they fight? Those details are more valuable than any archive. Every name spoken keeps that generation from disappearing into a number. But the story is not finished because there is one more piece of this. The piece the German command never fully understood, and the piece that made the whole American system add up to something more than the sum of its parts. It is a piece about who was giving the orders and about how the American infantry commander thought because he too had grown up in the same country as his men. Part 5 plus verdict. The country that won the American infantry officer of 1944 was not on average a career military man. The U.S. Army had grown from about 190,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million by 1945. Most of the men wearing captain's or major's bars in a Normandy field had been civilians 4 or 5 years earlier. They were lawyers, teachers, small-town business owners, engineers. They'd come up through the ranks or through officer candidate school, and they carried into their commands the cultural assumptions of the country they had left. That country was and had long been a country of defenders, not defenders in the international sense. Americans in 1944 were pushing across Europe as invaders, however welcome. Defenders in the domestic sense. Americans thought about ground the way a farmer thinks about a farm. You held it. You marked its boundaries. You knew where the fence lines ran. And when something threatened it, a coyote, a fire, a neighbor's stray cattle, you did not go on a wide-ranging offensive. You closed the gate. You brought in the animals, and you positioned yourself to see everything that could come in. This was the invisible mental architecture inside the head of an American infantry captain looking at a Norman village. He did not think about hunting the German shooter. He thought about occupying the village, about which windows had lines of sight into which streets, about where a shooter could sit to threaten his men, and how to make that shooter's day miserable before his men ever walked in. The German curriculum had been built around the Soviet enemy, and against that enemy, it had produced the most effective sniper program of the war. Matthias Hetzenau's 345 kills were and remain one of the highest confirmed sniper totals in any war. Sepp Allerberger's 257. These men were not lucky. They were the product of a systematic pedagogy that understood the sniper duel down to its finest details. But the pedagogy had a gap in it that no one in Udenberg or Vienna or Berlin had ever noticed. It had never taught what to do when the enemy was not another sniper. It had never taught what to do when the enemy was essentially a whole country of hunters who had grown up thinking about being the hunted rather than about doing the hunting. We cannot know how many German shooters died in the West. The Wehrmacht's own casualty records did not distinguish snipers as a separate category with any consistency, and the post-war chaos destroyed many of the records that did exist. But we know some individual fates. Pedenau himself was captured on the Eastern Front and spent 5 years in Soviet forced labor, a fate that at least did not leave him executed in a ditch. Allerberger, before his surrender to American forces, placed his beloved Ga-43 sniper rifle under the tracks of a Sturmgutz assault gun so it would not fall into Allied hands. His war ended in 1945. His memoir, published decades later under a pseudonym, tells the story of a man who had killed for years and could not bring himself to speak plainly about who he had been. There is one other haunting piece of evidence quiet in the archives from the second half of 1944 and into 1945. Young German snipers, poorly trained, sent into the fight in the West as the Reich ran out of experienced men. They were often teenagers from Hitler Youth backgrounds. When they were compromised, they did not do what an experienced Eastern Front veteran would have done, which was slip out and try to survive to fight again. They stayed in their positions and shot until they ran out of ammunition or were killed. The Americans, in their gallows humor, called them the suicide boys. They disrupted operations badly, but they died in place at 18 or 19, in the corners of forests they'd never seen before that week. The men who defeated all of them are, in most cases, unknown. There is no monument to the American infantry captain who taught his platoon to fire at every shadowy hedgerow before crossing an open field. There is no textbook chapter on the anonymous farm boy from Kentucky or Iowa or Vermont who looked at a Norman tree line and asked the question no German instructor had ever anticipated. Where would I be if I were the one being hunted? The verdict on this small, forgotten piece of the war is this: the Germans built the best sniper program of the Second World War. It was the product of years of Eastern Front experience, disciplined pedagogy, and a national tradition of marksmanship that reached back centuries. In the East, it worked brilliantly. In the West, it collided with something that was not a sniper program at all. A national reflex embedded in millions of ordinary men of thinking about ground the way a defender thinks about it. Not where do I shoot from, but where would someone be if they were trying to shoot me? Not the hunter's question, the hider's question. And the hider's question asked by enough ordinary men added up to the end of German sharpshooting in the West. Not because those ordinary men outshot the specialists, they did not. Almost none of them individually could match a Hetzau or an Allerberger with a rifle at 800 meters. But they did not need to. They needed to see the position before the position saw them, or to correctly guess the position so completely that the mortar rounds landed on top of it before the second shot ever came. They saw, they guessed. And the German shooter, the finest hunter in the 20th century's finest army, died in a hedge to a farm boy who was thinking about the shape of the ground the way his father had taught him to think about it when they hunted deer together in a Kentucky autumn. The lesson is not just about sharpshooting, it is about the whole architecture of war. Armies build training around the enemies they expect, and the enemies they expect are usually enemies that look like themselves. The Germans expected snipers. They got a country the country won. If this forensic look at a forgotten piece of the Second World War meant something to you, hit the like button. It helps the channel reach the people who care about getting the history right. Not the version that came out of the sniper schools, but the version that came out of the fields. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. The men who died in those hedgerows on both sides deserve to be understood, not just remembered as numbers. And the American farm boys, who never called themselves snipers, but who nonetheless ended one of the deadliest sharpshooting programs in history, deserve to be seen for what they actually did. They did not hunt the hunters. They defended the ground.